Hey guys. Tonight we begin with the remarkable, freezing, and frankly miserable lives of medieval peasants in winter. The everyday heroes who, with no heating, no electricity, and walls made mostly of mud and optimism, somehow managed not to die on the coldest nights in history. From stuffing their walls with anything that would fit, to sleeping in shifts like a tiny exhausted army, their story is one of grit, cleverness, and sheer stubbornness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always lovely to see who's drifting off with me from all around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might picture jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter wasn't about any of that. Winter was about one simple, nightly question: how do we not die before morning? It wasn't just a season. It was a yearly test of endurance, like a particularly cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. So get cozy. You won't last the whole way. You'll be fast asleep long before we're done. And honestly, that's the whole idea. Picture this. You're a medieval peasant and winter has arrived. Not the cozy, cinnamon-scented winter of holiday adverts, the real one, where the sun clocks off at around 4 in the afternoon and doesn't bother showing up again for what feels like a geological age. In deep winter, much of Europe got maybe 7 or 8 hours of thin, watery daylight, and then 16 hours of darkness so complete you could lose your own house from 20 paces. And there was no fighting it. No streetlights, no glow on the horizon, no little screen to scroll until you dozed off. When the sun went down, the world simply switched off. So the first rule of surviving a medieval winter was wonderfully simple: don't fight the dark. Surrender to it. You went inward into the home, into the small wobbling circle of firelight, and you became a slower, sleepier, more patient version of yourself. Winter, more than anything, was the art of waiting. And occasionally, of not freezing to death while you waited. At the center of all that waiting sat the hearth. For most peasant families, home was a single smoky room, timber, mud, packed earth, and a thick thatch roof, and right in the middle of it, an open fire burning on the bare clay floor. No chimney for the poor, mind you. The smoke just sort of wandered around the room looking for a way out, eventually finding a hole in the roof, or giving up and seeping through the thatch. So yes, the air was thick. Eyes watered. The rafters turned black and glossy with soot. But that same smoke quietly earned its keep. It kept bugs out of the thatch, helped preserve the meat hung up above, and most importantly, it meant warmth. And warmth in January was the whole ballgame. Which is why that fire was never, ever allowed to go out. Letting the hearth die in midwinter wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a small catastrophe. Lighting a fire from scratch, with flint and steel and a scrap of dry tinder, was slow, fiddly, knuckle-bruising work at the best of times, and roughly as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance when everything was damp and frozen. So at night, the fire wasn't put out. It was tucked in. The embers were heaped up and buried under a blanket of ash, banking the fire, they called it, so the heat could smolder gently through the night, ready to be coaxed back to life at dawn. It was the last job of the evening, usually done half asleep by feel, while quietly resenting whoever's turn it was tomorrow. Now when you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you learn very quickly that winter breezes aren't a mild nuisance, they're personal attacks. Walls warped. Mud crumbled. Thatch sagged. The cold found a fresh new gap to sneak through every single night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. So sealing up the house became a genuine art form. Peasants stuffed every crack with moss, straw, old rags, dry grass, bundled reeds. Honestly, if it was soft, squishy, and vaguely insulating, it got jammed into a hole somewhere. The truly committed would slap an extra layer of mud, and sometimes animal dung, over the outside walls as a charming little annual project. Just imagine standing there in the freezing wind, smearing cold manure onto your own house, muttering, "This is fine. This is luxury," and in a way it genuinely was. Windows, if you were posh enough to have one, were covered with animal hide or thick cloth soaked in animal fat, which kept out the worst of the draft and threw in a bonus aroma of mystery meat, free of charge. Every home slowly turned into a sad little patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. But here's the thing, it worked. Through cleverness, stubbornness, and a flat refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent lifestyle, peasants patched and stuffed and muddled their way through, one cold handful of moss at a time. Here's the secret about surviving a medieval winter. It wasn't actually survived in winter. It was survived back in autumn. By the time the first frost hit, the real work was already done, in those frantic late summer weeks of harvesting and salting, and drying absolutely everything that could be saved. Grain threshed and kept dry from the rats. Meat for the lucky few who had any, salted rock hard, or smoked over that same hearth. Beans dried, apples stored, cabbages and onions hung up, some vegetables simply buried in the cold earth to be dug out later like edible treasure. Because once winter properly arrived, nothing new grew. What you had in October was, more or less, what you had to stretch until spring. So the winter menu was, let's say, focused. At the heart of it sat pottage, a thick, slow stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were left, bubbling away at the edge of the fire and topped up day after day after day. Possibly the same pot of pottage your grandmother started. With it came heavy dark bread, and if you were fortunate, a little cheese or salted bacon for flavor. It wasn't exciting. It was never meant to be. It was warm, it was filling, and crucially it lasted. The real fear wasn't boredom at the dinner table. It was the slow, nervous arithmetic of the stores running low while the snow was still piled high outside, that long, anxious stretch of late winter people grimly called the hungry gap, when last year's food was nearly gone and this year's hadn't even thought about growing yet. And then there was the medieval peasant's secret weapon against the cold, a weapon that moved. In a lot of households, the surviving livestock, a cow or two, a pig, some goats, weren't kept out in a freezing barn. They were brought inside, parked at one end of the very same room the family lived in, separated by little more than a low wooden partition and a strong sense of acceptance. And it made perfect sense in every direction. The animals were far too valuable to risk losing to the cold or to thieves. They needed feeding and minding. And let's be honest, the warmth pouring off a couple of large, gently steaming cows took a real bite out of the chill at the human end of the house. The smell, the noise, the occasional 3 a.m. rustle. Nobody cared. Warmth was warmth, and in deep winter you did not turn your nose up at a free radiator just because it had hooves. Keeping those animals alive was its own quiet battle, though. Every mouthful of feed handed to the cow was a mouthful weighed against the family's own dwindling stores. In the hardest years it came down to a brutal sum. How many beasts can we realistically carry through to spring, and how many get slaughtered in autumn and salted away? The animals that made it through winter were, in their own muddy way, survivors right alongside the people they kept warm. Which brings us at last to sleep. And medieval peasants did not sleep the way we do. For one, when the cold bit hard enough, they didn't even pretend everyone could sleep at once. Instead, they ran a system that would make any army sergeant proud. They slept in shifts. It wasn't grand or organized. There were no whistles, no rotas pinned to the wall. Half the household curled up under threadbare blankets and hay to grab a few hours of half-frozen sleep, while the other half stayed up on ember patrol, feeding the fire and plugging stray drafts. Because remember, if that fire died, relighting it was an ordeal, so somebody always had to stay awake, poke it, prod it, gently curse it back to life, and try very hard not to step on a goat in the dark. Nobody volunteered for this. You doze off, finally get warmish, and then get elbowed awake by a sibling so you could go take your turn shivering by the hearth. Children old enough to hold a stick were drafted in early. Everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents got to sit by the fire a little longer, partly out of respect for their experience, and partly because, frankly, arthritis made lying down and getting back up again a monumental event. And they slept close. Whole families piled onto a single bed or a cluster of straw mattresses by the fire, heaped with every blanket and skin they owned. Sharing a bed wasn't poverty to be embarrassed about, it was strategy. Bodies warmed other bodies. The youngest and the oldest, always the first to suffer in the cold, were tucked right into the middle, into the warmest spot, surrounded on all sides by everyone else. So the next time you roll over in your soft, supportive mattress, reach out and tap a little button to nudge the heating up half a degree. Spare a thought for the medieval peasant, squinting into a smoking fire at 3 in the morning, wondering whether toes are really all that important. Because for all the mud, the smoke, the frozen mornings, and the hooved roommates, they figured it out. Surviving a medieval winter was never one great act of heroism. It was 1,000 tiny, patient, slightly ridiculous habits, repeated night after night after night, banking the fire, stuffing the cracks, counting the stores, and huddling close in the dark. Quiet, unglamorous, and astonishingly good at keeping people alive. And maybe lying there now, warm under your own blankets in your own quiet room, it isn't so different after all. The cold outside, the warmth within, the slow, certain pull toward sleep. So let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. The fire is banked, and the long night will keep. Rest now. We'll drift somewhere new while you sleep. Now, while the fire settles and you drift a little deeper, let's wander back even further, past the medieval peasants we just left huddled by their embers, to a winter so strange, so long, and so deeply miserable that it makes their worst nights look almost cozy by comparison. Because if you think one cold winter sounds rough, let me introduce you to the year a scholar once called, quite simply, the worst year in human history to be alive. The year 536. Now, 536 didn't announce itself with anything dramatic. There was no great battle, no famous emperor toppling from his throne. It started, as far as anyone could tell at the time, with the sun simply giving up. Not setting, not vanishing in an eclipse that politely ends after a few minutes. It just dimmed. A strange, dry fog rolled across the sky over Europe, the Middle East, and large parts of Asia, and it stayed there. For about 18 months. A Byzantine writer named Procopius, who you can imagine squinting up at the sky in deep confusion, recorded that the sun gave off light, like the moon, all year long, pale, feeble, and utterly without warmth. The sun was up there. You could look right at it, which is never a good sign. It simply wasn't doing its one job. And when the sun stops working, everything else quietly starts to fall apart. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by several degrees, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that crops are extremely fussy about that sort of thing. Snow reportedly fell in summer in China. Frost crept into places that had never really met it. Harvests failed not in one unlucky village, but across entire continents at once. And a world that lived almost entirely hand-to-mouth, season to season, suddenly found the season had betrayed them completely. What the people of 536 could not possibly have known, because nobody would figure it out for nearly 1,500 years, was the cause. The best evidence we have today points to a massive volcanic eruption, probably in Iceland, hurling so much ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere that it wrapped the planet in a thin, sun-blocking veil. A volcanic winter on a global scale. And then, as if the universe were simply showing off how bad it could make things, more eruptions seem to have followed in 540 and 547, stacking misery on top of misery. We know this now thanks to ice. Deep cores drilled out of the glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica trap tiny layers of the atmosphere, year by year, like the world's most patient diary. And right around 536, those layers are smudged with volcanic ash. The ice remembered the catastrophe long after every human who lived through it had turned to dust, quietly keeping the receipt for over 1,000 years. But the people living through it only knew the consequences. And the consequences were brutal. With harvests failing year after year, famine swept across the known world. Weakened, starving populations are easy targets for disease, and disease duly arrived. Just a few years later, in 541, came the plague of Justinian, one of the deadliest pandemics in all of history, which tore through the Byzantine Empire and beyond, killing, by some estimates, a third or more of the people in the regions it touched. It was, all told, a genuinely apocalyptic stretch of decades. The dimmed sun, the failed crops, the famine, the plague, a chain of dominoes that began with a mountain exploding somewhere nobody was even watching. Some historians argue this grim cluster of years reshaped the entire course of civilization, weakening empires, emptying cities, and helping tip the ancient world over the edge into what we'd later call the Dark Ages, a name that, given the literal dimming of the sky, feels almost too on the nose. And yet, and this is the part worth holding on to as you drift off, people survived even this. Not all of them. Not easily. But enough. They did exactly what our medieval peasants did, only against far worse odds. They huddled together, they rationed what little they had, they kept their small fires burning, and they waited. They had no idea why the sun had gone out. They had no way of knowing if it would ever come back. And still, night after sunless night, they simply endured and trusted that morning meant something. Eventually, slowly, the veil thinned. The dust settled out of the sky. The sun, after a year and a half of doing a frankly terrible impression of the moon, remembered how to be the sun again. Warmth returned. Crops grew. The survivors, fewer and wearier than before, planted once more. So as you lie there now, warm and safe, with a sun that will, almost certainly, rise tomorrow exactly as it's supposed to, you can let that be a small comfort. The worst year in history ended. The light came back. It always, eventually, comes back. Rest now. There's more to wander through, but it can wait until you're ready. 2. A day in the life of a medieval peasant daily life equals 109K now. While you settle in and the fire burns low, let's drift somewhere else entirely. Away from the mud and frost and hay mattresses of medieval England, and into something a little sharper, a little more dangerous, and considerably more dramatic. Tonight we're going to talk about a woman who didn't just survive the most treacherous court in English history. She rewrote it. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head or armies at her feet. Born around 1501, probably at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, she was the daughter of a knight. Respectable, comfortable, but hardly destined for greatness. Yet from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was already taking root. Her early years were spent abroad, which was unusual for an English girl. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the glittering court of the Netherlands, soaking up the manners and fashions and sheer sophistication of continental Europe. Then on to France, where she spent years learning exactly the kind of dangerous knowledge that no finishing school would ever teach. How to command a room without raising your voice. How to make powerful men feel clever while you were quietly outthinking them. How to want something enormous and show none of it on your face. While other young women perfected their embroidery, Anne was mastering intrigue. She wasn't classically beautiful, even her admirers admitted as much. But she was arresting. Dark, intelligent eyes, a sharp mind, a way of speaking that made you lean forward without quite knowing why. She had seen what charm and wit could do in foreign courts, and she fully intended to put that knowledge to work when she came home. When Anne returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone there. She dressed differently, spoke differently, thought differently. She played lute, she debated theology. She had opinions and wasn't shy about sharing them. And at first she played the role expected of her, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence was impossible to ignore. The court buzzed, and then came the most dangerous attention of all. Henry VIII noticed her. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because when Henry VIII decided he wanted something, he got it. He had always gotten it. He was the most powerful man in England. He was charming, intelligent, physically imposing, terrifyingly capable of violence. And he had decided he wanted Anne Boleyn. There was just one problem. Anne said no. She refused. Henry, who was completely unused to the word no from anyone except possibly the Pope, was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the harder he fell. Letters poured out of him, passionate, embarrassing letters, 17 of which somehow survive in the Vatican archives, which says something about the whole situation that we don't have time to fully unpack tonight. Anne's position was astonishing. She would not be a royal mistress. She had watched other women walk that road and knew exactly where it ended. In the shadows, forgotten, replaced. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. And since Henry was already very much married to Catherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the niece of the most powerful emperor in Europe, that was going to be a problem. What followed was one of the most dramatic divorces in Western history. Henry went to the Pope to have his marriage to Catherine annulled. He argued that the marriage had been invalid from the start. The Pope disagreed. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, who more or less had the Pope in his pocket at this point, disagreed quite forcefully. Henry pressed. The Pope stalled. The years passed. Anne waited. And Henry, who had once been the Pope's most devoted defender, and had been given the title Defender of the Faith for his writings against Luther, slowly began to do something unthinkable. He began to consider breaking with Rome entirely. Which is exactly what happened. Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He pushed through Parliament. He did what centuries of English kings had never done. He defied the most powerful religious institution in the world. And he did it at least partly because Anne Boleyn told him she would not be his mistress. So next time someone tells you that one person can't change history, you can politely remind them that a woman's refusal to accept a lesser deal once fractured Western Christianity. In January 1533, Henry and Anne married in secret. By June, Anne was formally crowned Queen of England in a ceremony of breathtaking splendor. Some cheered. Many muttered prayers for Catherine. Almost everyone was scared of what came next. And for a time, Anne's star burned brilliantly. She was the hope of a dynasty, the queen who would finally give Henry the son he so desperately wanted. She was bold, politically sharp, a genuine patron of religious reform, and she made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Then came September 1533. The child was born, and it was a girl. Her name was Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was visible even on the day of the birth. His eyes, once full of adoration, flickered with something colder. Still, for a time, things held together. Anne remained queen. The court continued to revolve around her. But miscarriages followed, and with each loss, Henry's patience thinned. He began to look elsewhere. He noticed a calm, quiet lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour, who was in almost every way Anne's opposite. Soft-spoken, compliant, offering no arguments and no challenges. Henry was interested, and Anne, who was perceptive enough to notice, began to fight. She argued, demanded, pushed back against Henry in ways that had once fascinated him, but now merely irritated a man who wanted peace and a male heir. The court shifted around her. Allies became cautious. Enemies grew bolder. Thomas Cromwell, who had once been her great ally in reforming the English church, sensed the changing tide. And Cromwell, who was brilliant and utterly ruthless, began to build a case against her. Accusations were assembled. Adultery, incest, treason. They were riddled with contradictions, impossibilities, dates that didn't match. But Henry needed an exit, and Cromwell provided one. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She entered through the same gate she had once passed through in triumph on her way to her coronation. Now she would not leave alive. The trial was swift, and the verdict was never in doubt. Anne was found guilty. Her brother and 4 other men were condemned alongside her. She denied every charge with intelligence and composure that astonished even her enemies. It made no difference. On the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green. She was somewhere between 30 and 35 years old. She faced her death with extraordinary dignity. She made no declaration of guilt. She simply asked for prayers for the king, for the kingdom, and then it was over. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. 17 months after that, Jane gave him a son. The boy was named Edward. Henry had gotten what he always wanted. But the daughter Anne had given him, the unwanted girl who had arrived on that disappointing September morning, that daughter went on to become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in English history. 45 years on the throne. The Elizabethan age. Shakespeare, Drake, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Not a bad legacy for a queen who was executed for treason. So next time someone tells you history is made by kings, maybe remember the woman who said no and changed everything. Now let's drift across the ocean and forward through time a bit, because history has more late nights in store for us. We're heading to the American colonies, 1773, and a harbor full of tea that was about to become the most politically significant cup that was never actually drunk. The story of the Boston Tea Party is one of those stories that gets taught in schools in such a tidy version that you almost forget how strange and combustible the whole thing actually was. So let's take a slower look. Starting, as all good stories do, with the money. Britain in the 1760s had a problem. The 7 Years' War, which Americans would come to call the French and Indian War, had cost an enormous amount of money. Britain had fought it on multiple continents, defending among other things the American colonies themselves from French expansion. And now someone had to pay for it. The British government, with what seemed to it like perfect logic, decided that the American colonies should contribute. They had benefited from the war. They had British troops protecting them. They should help with the bill. And so came the Stamp Act. Then the Townshend Acts. Taxes on paper, paint, glass, and tea. The colonists were furious. Not necessarily because the amounts were ruinous. In some cases they were relatively small, but because of a principle that would echo down through centuries. No taxation without representation. The colonists had no elected members in the British Parliament. They had no say in these taxes. And to them, that wasn't a technicality. It was a fundamental violation of their rights as English subjects. Protests erupted. Boycotts began. The colonists refused to buy British goods. British merchants, watching their profits collapse, pressured Parliament. Most of the townshend duties were eventually repealed. The tax on tea stayed, kept deliberately as a symbolic assertion that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies if it chose to. A small but pointed reminder of who was in charge. The colonists received this reminder with exactly the warmth you would expect. Then came 1773 and the Tea Act. This one was actually meant to help the colonists. The British East India Company, which was essentially too big to fail even in 1773, was sitting on £17 million of unsold tea and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The Tea Act was designed to bail it out by allowing the company to sell its tea directly to the colonies, cutting out middlemen and making the tea cheaper than ever before. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price of the tea. It was the principle. The Tea Act still left the hated tax on tea in place. Accepting the tea, even at a lower price, would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them. And the colonial merchants who had previously imported tea through the normal channels, and who were now being cut out of the market entirely, were furious in a much more personally financial way. Tea ships began arriving in colonial ports. In Philadelphia and New York, they were turned back. In Boston, the royal governor Thomas Hutchinson, whose sons happened to be tea consignees who stood to profit from the arrangement, refused to let the ships leave without unloading. The tea sat in the harbor. A legal deadline approached, after which it would be seized and sold anyway. The Sons of Liberty, a patriot organization that included a certain Samuel Adams among its leading lights, had been planning something. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of between 30 and 116 men, the historical accounts vary, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, which was a costume that fooled approximately nobody, and marched down to Griffin's Wharf. They boarded 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Aliner, and the Beaver. And over the course of 3 hours, with remarkable calm and efficiency, they opened 342 chests of tea and dumped the entire lot into Boston Harbor. They were careful. They replaced a padlock they accidentally broke. They swept the decks clean when they were done. They did not steal anything. They did not harm anyone. They were making a statement, not committing a robbery, and they wanted that distinction to be clear. The next morning, Boston Harbor smelled like the world's largest cup of tea, and the world had changed. Britain's response was swift and furious. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists immediately renamed the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. Massachusetts' self-government was curtailed. The quartering of soldiers in private homes was expanded. It was punishment meant to isolate Massachusetts and make an example of it. Instead, it united the colonies. Other colonies sent food and supplies to besieged Boston. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity. Delegates began planning what would become the First Continental Congress. Benjamin Franklin, in London at the time trying to negotiate a settlement, watched the situation deteriorate with growing despair. He had hoped for reconciliation. He believed in the British Empire. He genuinely thought a solution could be found. But Britain's response to Boston left less and less room for that hope. In the streets of London, some voices spoke in favor of the colonists. Edmund Burke gave a magnificent speech arguing for conciliation. But they were outvoted, outnumbered by men who saw the colonists' resistance as simple defiance that needed to be crushed. General Thomas Gage was sent to Boston as military governor. Troops poured in. The city became an occupied city. And in the Massachusetts countryside, men began quietly gathering weapons and forming themselves into militia companies that could be ready at a moment's notice. They called themselves Minutemen. And by April 1775, the moment had very nearly come. On the 18th of April, 1775, a British column marched out of Boston in the night, heading for the town of Concord, where they had intelligence that the colonists were storing arms. 2 riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, rode out ahead of them to warn the countryside. Whether Revere actually shouted "the British are coming" is disputed, since at the time most people still considered themselves British, and the phrase would have been confusing. What he actually shouted was more along the lines of "the regulars are out." But he rode, and the countryside woke up. At dawn on April 19th, when the British column reached the town of Lexington, 77 Minutemen were waiting on the green. Someone fired. Nobody knows who. It was the shot heard round the world, as Emerson would later write, and it started a war. The British pushed on to Concord, found fewer weapons than expected, and began to march back to Boston. And that is where things got very bad for them. The colonial militia had had all day to respond. They lined the roads back to Boston. They fired from behind stone walls and trees and fences, from farmhouses and barns, and the British column, trained to fight in open formation against European armies, had no answer for it. The march back became a running disaster. Hundreds of British soldiers were killed or wounded by the time they reached Boston. The colonial militia had lost fewer than 100 men. Within days, thousands of colonial volunteers had surrounded Boston, trapping the British Army inside the city. And the American Revolution had begun. So next time you put the kettle on and reach for the tea bags, spare a thought for those cold men in their unconvincing Mohawk costumes, heaving chest after chest over the side of a ship in the dark. They started something that night that the whole world is still living inside of. And now one more drift. Let's go somewhere even further back. Before the Revolution, before the Tudors, before even the medieval peasants we started with tonight. We are going to travel to the Supe Valley in Peru, roughly 5,000 years ago, to a city that most people have never heard of. A city that rewrote what we thought we knew about civilization itself. Its name is Carroll, and for a very long time it was invisible. Not literally invisible. It was always there. But for decades, archaeologists walked past it and saw nothing but a series of dusty mounds in the desert, assumed to be natural formations, unremarkable hills in an unremarkable valley. Then in the late 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady began to excavate. And what she found underneath those mounds was extraordinary. A city, a fully planned, intentionally designed, monumental urban center, with public plazas and residential districts and vast pyramid complexes. Carbon dating placed its origins at around 2600 BCE. Carroll was contemporary with the early pyramids of Egypt, with the Sumerian city-states of Mesopotamia, with the Indus Valley civilization. It was one of the oldest cities on Earth, and it was in South America. This was not what anyone expected, because for a long time, the understanding in archaeology was that great civilizations arose in the Old World first. In the Fertile Crescent, in China, in Egypt, and only later spread or developed independently elsewhere. Carroll upended that story entirely. Here was a complex society in the Americas that was just as ancient as anything in the Near East. A society that had independently arrived at the idea of the city, of monumental architecture, of organized civic life, without any contact with the Old World whatsoever. It had worked it out for itself. From scratch. The implications were significant, and slightly humbling for everyone who had been confidently explaining human history. What was life like in Carroll? The picture that archaeology has uncovered is surprisingly sophisticated. The city was built with impressive engineering knowledge. The pyramids were constructed using a technique called shikra, which involved filling large woven reed bags with stones and using them as building units. It sounds simple, but it was remarkably effective and earthquake-resistant, which in this part of the world is not a minor consideration. The city had sunken circular plazas, which appear to have been gathering places for communal events, and larger platform mounds that were likely ceremonial centers. There was evidence of specialized production, some areas of the city dedicated to fishing net production, others to agriculture, others to the processing of industrial plants like cotton. Trade networks extended outward from Carroll in multiple directions. Cotton grown in the valley was traded to coastal communities in exchange for dried fish and shellfish. Other goods traveled inland toward the mountains. Carroll sat at the center of a web of exchange that stretched for hundreds of miles. And here is one of the most remarkable things about Carroll. In all the excavations, in all the years of careful archaeological work at this site, researchers found no evidence of warfare. No weapons, no fortifications, no mass graves, no signs of violent conflict whatsoever. This is genuinely unusual for ancient civilizations. In most of the world's early cities, the archaeological record includes plenty of evidence of violence, defensive walls, weapons caches, skeletal remains showing battle injuries. Carroll has none of that. What it has instead, and this is where it gets interesting, is music. Archaeologists found 32 flutes made from condor and pelican bones, and 37 cornets made from deer and llama bones. Music, it appears, was not a luxury in Carroll. It was central. Instruments were everywhere. The picture that emerges is of a society that organized itself around ceremony, trade, and shared civic life, rather than around military power. A civilization that built its pyramids not as fortresses, but as places of gathering. What ended Carroll is not fully understood. Around 1800 BCE, roughly 800 years after its founding, the city was gradually abandoned. Climate change, shifting river courses, disruptions to the trade networks it depended on, all of these have been suggested. Whatever the cause, Carroll's population drifted away. The buildings were not destroyed. They were simply left, and the desert slowly covered them, until they became the unremarkable mounds that nobody thought to excavate for thousands of years. The city slept under the sand, waiting. For nearly 4,000 years, Carroll remained hidden, sleeping under the dust. And then Ruth Shady came with her brushes and her patience and her willingness to look more carefully than everyone before her. And the city woke up again. And what it told us when it did changed the story of humanity in ways we are still working through. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, carrying with you a medieval peasant's practical wisdom, and a Tudor queen's extraordinary nerve, and the stubborn principle of a harbor full of ruined tea, carry also this. A city that organized itself around music and trade and ceremony rather than walls and weapons, and lasted 800 years in a desert. We don't know their names. We can't read their language. But we can hear just barely the echo of their flutes in the dry Peruvian air, if we are quiet enough to listen. Be quiet now. Let your breathing slow. The fire is low, and the long night is doing its patient work. Rest now. There is more history waiting for you, but it will keep until morning. Sleep well. Let's keep moving. Forward and sideways through history, the way a good sleepy drift tends to go. We have been to medieval England and Tudor courts, and colonial harbors and Peruvian deserts. Now we are going somewhere colder and louder, and considerably more bearded. We are going to the Norse world, roughly the year 900, and to a group of people whose reputation has been thoroughly and somewhat unfairly managed by their enemies. The Vikings. The word itself probably comes from the Old Norse word for a raid or a journey. And there is a version of Viking history that begins and ends there, with the raids. The fearsome warriors who fell on monasteries and coastal towns and left smoldering ruins behind them. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is very incomplete. Because the same people who raided Lindisfarne in 793 and terrorized the coasts of France and Ireland also founded Dublin and Kiev, and discovered Iceland and Greenland, and almost certainly reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. They were merchants and explorers and settlers and poets and farmers, and sometimes, yes, quite terrifyingly, raiders. The combination made them one of the most consequential peoples in European history. So what was daily life actually like for a Viking who was not currently raiding anyone? For the vast majority of the Norse population, life was farming. Most Vikings never set foot on a longship, except maybe to cross a river. They grew barley and oats and rye, kept cattle and sheep, cut hay in summer to see the animals through the long, dark winter, exactly like the medieval peasants we met at the start of tonight. The climate in Scandinavia made this challenging. The growing season was short. The winters were brutal. But the Norse had developed agricultural techniques adapted to their environment, and their communities, built around extended family groups called the kindred, were tightly knit by necessity. The longhouse was the center of Norse life. It could be enormous by medieval standards, up to 70 or 80 feet long in wealthy households, housing both the family and their animals in winter, everyone sharing warmth the way our medieval peasants did, because warmth in a Scandinavian winter is not optional. The roof was low and the smoke was thick, and the smell was what it was. But it was warm, and that was everything. Norse society was hierarchical, but not rigidly so. At the top were the jarls, the powerful landowners and chieftains. Below them the carls, the free farmers who formed the backbone of Norse society and had genuine legal rights, including the right to speak at the thing, the local assembly where disputes were settled and laws were made. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved people, which was unfortunately a real and large part of Viking society, and one of the primary motivations for raiding, since capturing people to sell or keep was often more profitable than stealing gold. The thing is worth pausing on, because it represents something genuinely interesting about Norse political culture. These were societies in which free men had a say in how they were governed. Not everyone, not women, not thralls, but a surprisingly broad slice of the free male population had the right to attend the assembly, to speak, to vote on laws, to bring legal cases and have them heard. Iceland in particular developed one of the earliest parliamentary systems in the world, the Althing, which met annually and governed the whole island through elected representatives and oral law. It was contentious and messy, and sometimes ended in violence, but it was recognizable as a form of democracy 800 years before most of Europe got around to the idea. The Norse had a remarkable literary culture. Their sagas, epic prose narratives written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, but preserving stories from much earlier, are some of the most compelling literature of the medieval period. Stories of feuds and voyages and kings and gods, told with a dry, deadpan wit that feels surprisingly modern. Odin hanging from the world tree for 9 days to gain wisdom. Thor arguing with a serpent. Loki causing chaos for everyone, because that is simply what Loki does. The Norse mythology that has saturated popular culture for decades now has its roots in this tradition, and it holds up. The original stories are genuinely strange and funny, and moving in ways that the adaptations don't always manage. And then there were the voyages. This is where the Vikings become truly extraordinary. They built ships that were, by any standard, engineering marvels. Flexible enough to flex with the ocean rather than crack against it. Shallow enough to navigate rivers and be dragged across land. Fast enough to cross the North Atlantic. By 874, Norse settlers had reached Iceland, finding it largely uninhabited except for a small community of Irish monks who promptly left. By 985, Eric the Red, having been exiled from Iceland for violence, which even in Viking society was considered going a bit far, had sailed further west and found Greenland. His son Leif Erikson pushed further still, reaching somewhere on the North American coast around the year 1000. We know this not just from the sagas, but from archaeology. A Viking settlement was excavated at Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland in the 1960s, radiocarbon dated precisely to around the year 1000. The Norse were in North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They didn't stay, but they were there. So next time you feel overwhelmed by the idea of navigating somewhere unfamiliar, Spare a thought for the people who crossed the North Atlantic in open wooden boats by reading the stars and the behavior of seabirds, without a map, in the early medieval period. That is a specific kind of stubbornness that deserves its own word. Let's go further back again. Way back, to a morning roughly 2,000 years ago, in a city that at its peak held over 1 million people and considered itself, not entirely without justification, the center of the known world. We are in Rome. And rather than talking about emperors and battles, which Rome has in absolutely staggering supply, we are going to spend this segment on something much more ordinary. What it was actually like to wake up on a normal Tuesday morning in ancient Rome, assuming you were neither a senator nor a slave, but something in the vast middle ground. An ordinary Roman just trying to get through the day. First, the housing situation. Rome was an extraordinarily dense city for the ancient world, and most of its inhabitants lived not in the grand marble villas that fill our mental image of ancient Rome, but in apartment buildings called insulae. These were multi-story tenements, some reaching 5 or 6 stories, packed together along narrow streets. The upper floors were cheaper and correspondingly worse in almost every way. Further from the water supply at street level, which meant you carried your water up. Further from the ground, which meant that when, not if, but when the building caught fire, you were in serious trouble. Building fires were a constant hazard in ancient Rome, and the upper floors of cheap insulae were notoriously likely to collapse. Juvenal, the Roman satirist, complained that Rome was essentially a death trap of rotting, crumbling buildings held together by optimism, which may be slightly exaggerated, but is not entirely unfair. You woke early. Rome was a city of early risers by necessity. The streets were so narrow and so congested that wheeled vehicles were banned during daylight hours, so deliveries and cartage happened at night, meaning the city was loud with rumbling carts and shouting teamsters all night long, and then suddenly quiet at dawn when the ban lifted. You got up with the light or before it. You did not bathe at home. Very few apartments had running water, and even those that did rarely had private bathing facilities. Instead, you went to the baths, the thermae, which were public bathing complexes that were among the most remarkable civic institutions of the ancient world. The great imperial baths could hold thousands of people simultaneously, with hot rooms and warm rooms and cold plunges and exercise courtyards and libraries and gardens attached. The admission fee was low enough that nearly anyone could afford it. The baths were where you exercised, where you talked politics, where you conducted business, where you caught up on gossip, where you saw and were seen. They were a cross between a spa, a community center, a gym, and a social media platform, but one that made you physically cleaner rather than the reverse. Breakfast was not a Roman priority. A bit of bread, perhaps dipped in olive oil or wine, maybe some olives or cheese if you had them. The serious meal of the day was dinner, in the late afternoon, which could be elaborate or simple depending entirely on your circumstances. Lunch, if you had it, was typically something grabbed from one of the thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of fast food restaurants, small shops with built-in stone counters containing large heated containers of prepared food. Bread, stews, porridge, wine. Rome had hundreds of them. The city's population was simply too large and too densely housed for most people to do their own cooking, partly because cooking fires in a crowded wooden apartment building were a fire hazard, and partly because many apartments had no cooking facilities at all. A surprising amount of daily Roman life was conducted in public, eating, socializing, working, arguing, because the private spaces where most people lived were too small, too dark, and too crowded to be comfortable for long. The Forum, the great open public space at the center of Roman civic life, was where much of the important business of the day happened. Lawyers argued cases in the open air. Politicians gave speeches. Merchants struck deals. Citizens gathered to hear announcements and read the Acta Diurna, Rome's remarkable daily gazette, the first newspaper in history, posted on whitened boards throughout the city, and covering everything from official announcements to gladiatorial results to birth and death notices. Julius Caesar had started it, and by the 1st century it was an institution. You read the news in the morning, you discussed it in the baths, you argued about it over dinner. Roman society was deeply, passionately interested in information and opinion, and the mechanisms for distributing both were more sophisticated than most people realize. Evenings in Rome were by our standards rather dark. Oil lamps provided light, which was expensive and dim, and torches in the streets were unreliable. Most people went to bed not long after sunset, or if they were wealthy enough to afford lamp oil in quantity, spent the evening in the lamplight talking and eating and drinking. Dinner parties among the better-off classes were elaborate social events, reclining on couches, eating in courses, discussing politics and philosophy, and the utterly catastrophic behavior of whoever the current emperor was. The satirists and moralists of Rome complained constantly about the excess and decadence of these dinner parties, which probably means they were not invited, or that the parties were genuinely excessive, or both. Rome was a city that contained extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty within walking distance of each other. A city of 1 million people, of marble temples and crumbling slums, of magnificent public spaces and garbage in the streets. A city that was simultaneously one of the greatest achievements of human civilization and a fairly difficult place to actually live. Rather like most great cities then and now. So next time your apartment feels small, or your commute feels unbearable, or the city feels too loud, just remember that someone in ancient Rome was probably having approximately the same thought, lying on a straw mattress in a 5-story tenement while carts rattled past below, wondering if the building was going to last another winter. And now something darker. Something that makes the cold nights of our medieval peasants look, in retrospect, almost manageable. We need to talk about the Black Death. Not in a sensational way, not as a horror story exactly, but because it is one of the most transformative events in human history, and because understanding what it was like to live through, it tells us something important about resilience, and about how human communities survive the unsurvivable. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried on merchant ships from the east, and over the next 4 years it killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. Estimates vary, the records are imperfect, the mathematics of medieval demography are fraught, but the general consensus is that somewhere between 25 and 50 million people died in Europe alone. It was the greatest demographic catastrophe in European history, and arguably in world history. How did people experience it? We have remarkable sources. Contemporary chronicles, eyewitness accounts, letters, medical treatises, church records. The sheer quantity of documentation is partly because literate people who wrote things down, were trying to make sense of something that seemed to make no sense. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence in 1348, described what he saw with a terrifying clarity. Men and women alike abandoning the sick, even their own family members, in the streets. Corpses piling up faster than they could be buried, loaded onto carts and tipped into mass graves outside the city walls. Churches full of bodies. Social fabric unraveling not out of cowardice, but out of the simple recognition that proximity to the sick meant you were going to die too, and the medieval world had no germ theory, no understanding of contagion in any modern sense. They did not know what was killing them. They had theories. Bad air, miasma, the alignment of planets, God's punishment for human sin. The flagellant movement swept through Europe, groups of men marching from town to town, flogging themselves publicly, in an attempt to atone for the collective sins they believed had brought down this plague. They were desperate and sincere, and their self-mortification accomplished nothing whatsoever against Yersinia pestis, the bacterium they did not know existed. What is remarkable, and this is the thing history often forgets to mention, is how many people survived. Not just individually, though that too, but how communities continued to function. Markets continued in reduced form. Crops were still planted and harvested, though sometimes there was no one left to harvest them. Priests continued to administer last rites, though they died in enormous numbers doing so. Physicians continued to treat patients, often at their own peril. Nuns and monks continued to care for the sick in hospitals that were effectively death traps. The Black Death did not stop human life. It tore through it catastrophically, but enough people kept doing enough things that the fabric held just barely in enough places. And then over those 4 years, the worst of it passed. Not because anyone understood it or stopped it, but because not everyone was susceptible, because some populations had some immunity, because the rats and fleas that carried the bacterium and which nobody yet suspected moved on. And the survivors found themselves in a transformed world. The labor shortage that followed was significant. With a third to half the population dead, workers became scarce and therefore valuable in ways they had not been before the plague. Landlords who had kept serfs in near-feudal bondage found themselves unable to compel labor from people who could simply go elsewhere, because there was so much elsewhere to go to, so many empty farms and vacant positions. Wages rose. Serfs began to negotiate. Some ran away to towns and were never recovered. The rigid social hierarchies of medieval Europe began, very slowly, very imperfectly, to loosen. The Black Death was not the cause of the Renaissance. History is more complicated than that. But it was part of the Great Disruption, part of the loosening of old certainties, part of the long, painful process by which medieval Europe was dragged, unwilling and often screaming, into the early modern world. People who survived the Black Death had survived something that had killed everyone around them. That changes a person. It changes a society. The survivors were not necessarily traumatized into passivity. Many of them were angry and energetic and unwilling to go back to the way things had been. And the world they built in the decades that followed was different from the world they had inherited, in ways that were genuinely new. So as you lie there tonight, warm and safe in a world that has, against all odds, continued, know that the people who came before you survived things that seemed unsurvivable. Not all of them, not even most of them in the worst of times, but enough, always just barely enough. They kept going, and that is why you are here. That is why any of us are here. The great unbroken chain of people who were too stubborn to stop. The fire is very low now. The history is still out there, all of it, every story, every ordinary day and extraordinary catastrophe, all of it waiting. But it will wait. Close your eyes. You have heard enough for tonight. Sleep now and let the long, quiet dark do what it does. Rest. Let's keep going. We have more history to drift through before we're done, and next we are going somewhere very warm, which after all those medieval winters seems like a pleasant change. We are going to ancient Egypt. Not the Egypt of pharaohs on golden thrones, at least not primarily, but the Egypt of the people who actually built the pyramids, which is a much more interesting story than you might expect. For a long time, the popular imagination ran with the idea that the pyramids were built by slaves, whipped across the desert by cruel overseers. This was partly ancient propaganda by people who found the pyramids impressively mysterious and wanted them to have been built under terrible conditions. It made the story better. But archaeologists who have spent the last several decades carefully excavating the worker villages at Giza have found something rather different. The people who built the pyramids were paid workers. They received wages in the form of bread and beer, which was how the Egyptian economy largely functioned. They had doctors. Records show treatments for injuries common to heavy construction work. They were buried in respectable tombs near the pyramids they helped build, which would not have happened if they had been enslaved workers with no social standing. Graffiti found at the site includes the names of work gangs, names like Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkora, which suggests a certain esprit de corps that you would not expect from a slave workforce. Building a pyramid was, from an organizational standpoint, an extraordinary achievement. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains approximately 2.5 million stone blocks, each weighing on average about 2.5 tons. Getting all of those blocks from the quarries to the site, into position with accuracy good enough that the finished structure still stands after 4,500 years, required project management on a scale that would impress a modern construction company. The Egyptians had no cranes, no motors, no steel. What they had was organization. And water. The flooding of the Nile every year, far from being simply a natural event, was the engine of the Egyptian economy, depositing fertile silt across the flood plain, but also creating a vast network of canals that during flood season could be used to float enormous stone blocks on wooden sledges from quarries that would otherwise have been impossibly remote. The engineering was elegant. The labor was immense. And the result, the Great Pyramid, was the tallest structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years. Nobody surpassed it until the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 CE, and even that is disputed. 4,000 years is a remarkable record to set with copper tools and human organization. But what was daily life like for an ordinary Egyptian who was not building anything at the moment? The Nile Valley was one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the ancient world, and the rhythms of life were shaped entirely by the river. The flooding season, called Akhit, roughly July to October, brought the annual inundation that deposited the rich black silt the Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land, which gave the country its ancient name. During this time, much agricultural work was impossible, which is why construction projects like the pyramids were typically staffed during flood season when farmers had nothing else to do. The growing season Parrot followed the flood when crops were planted and tended. Then harvest Shemu, when the grain came in and the storehouses were filled. The entire Egyptian economy and the entire Egyptian state were built on this annual cycle of flooding and growing and harvesting, and on the ability of a centralized bureaucracy to store surplus grain and redistribute it during lean years. This is what the pharaoh actually did. Not perform religious rituals, though there were plenty of those too, but manage the agricultural economy of a narrow strip of land 2,000 miles long with extraordinary efficiency. Ordinary Egyptians lived in mud brick houses, mostly 1 or 2 rooms, whitewashed inside and out to reflect the heat. The furniture was simple. Beds of woven reeds, low tables, clay pots for storage and cooking. The diet was bread, beer, and whatever vegetables were in season, onions and garlic and leeks and beans, supplemented by fish from the Nile and occasionally meat, though meat was expensive and mostly reserved for festivals. The beer was thick, made from partially fermented bread, and was consumed by everyone from the pharaoh down to the most modest farmer, because the Nile water without treatment was genuinely dangerous to drink, and fermentation made it safe. You did not, in ancient Egypt, drink water if you could help it. You drank beer. The children drank beer. The doctors prescribed beer. It was simply the safe liquid. So next time someone looks at you disapprovingly for your habits, you can explain that you are following 4,000 years of Egyptian medical advice. Egyptian society had a relatively broad middle class by ancient standards. Scribes and craftsmen and merchants and priests occupied a social tier between the peasant farmers and the elite, and literacy, while never universal, was more widespread in ancient Egypt than in many contemporary societies. The ability to read and write opened doors to administrative positions, and administrative positions in Egypt were how you got ahead. The bureaucracy was enormous and omnipresent, and scribes, the people who made that bureaucracy function, were respected and reasonably well paid. There are scribal training texts that survive from ancient Egypt, teaching exercises designed to impress on young trainee scribes just how much better their future career was than every other possible option. The farmer works in the mud, the soldier is constantly in danger, the fisherman gets eaten by crocodiles. Be a scribe. It is the only sensible choice. The rhetorical strategy of motivating young people by telling them that every other path is terrible is apparently as old as writing itself. Let your breathing slow. The Nile is rising far away and long ago, and the great bureaucracy of the ancient world is quietly keeping records of everything. And the grain is in the storehouses, and everything is accounted for, and the flood will come again next year as it always has, and the black land will be fertile, and the world will continue as it does. We are going to London next, to a night in September 1666 when the city burned, and when, out of that burning, something unexpectedly better was eventually built. The Great Fire of London is one of those historical events that tends to be remembered primarily as a catastrophe, and it was certainly that. But it was also a story about how people behave when everything falls apart, and about the strange, stubborn way that cities and communities rebuild themselves. It started small, as most catastrophes do. A bakery on Pudding Lane, which is a real street name and not something I have invented for atmospheric effect. In the early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September 1666, a fire started in the oven of Thomas Fariner, a baker to the King's Navy. How exactly it escaped the bakery is not entirely clear. Fariner himself insisted it was not his fault. But escape it did, and into a city that was extraordinarily well suited to burning. London in 1666 was predominantly built of timber and thatch, packed incredibly densely along narrow medieval streets, the houses literally leaning toward each other overhead. It had been an unusually dry summer, and the wind that night was from the east, a strong, persistent wind that drove the fire westward across the city. The early response was inadequate. The Lord Mayor was woken in the middle of the night and famously remarked that a woman might piss it out, which he would live to regret. He went back to bed. By the time the scale of what was happening became clear, the fire had a substantial head start. Medieval firefighting involved pulling down buildings in the path of the fire to create fire breaks. This was effective if done aggressively and early. The problem was that the buildings you were pulling down belonged to someone, and that someone objected strenuously, and there were legal and financial complications. These complications were eventually overridden when King Charles II himself rode out into the streets and began directing the firefighting effort, taking a personal hand in pulling down buildings and passing buckets. It is one of the more unusual images of royal governance, the King of England up to his elbows in ash and river water, personally organizing a bucket chain. Over 4 days, the fire consumed roughly 400 acres of the city. It destroyed approximately 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, and most of the civic infrastructure of medieval London. St. Paul's Cathedral, the great medieval church that had stood for centuries, burned so intensely that the lade from its roof ran in rivers through the streets below. The human death toll is uncertain. The official records show only a handful of deaths, which seems impossibly low for a fire of this scale. Historians have debated this for centuries. The likely explanation is that many deaths, particularly among the poor who could not flee and who left no documentation, were simply not recorded. Thousands were left homeless, camping in the fields outside the ruined city. The scale of the loss was staggering. And then the rebuilding began. And this is where it gets interesting. Because the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire was one of the most important urban planning episodes in English history. Various plans were drawn up immediately by ambitious architects, including Christopher Wren, who had sweeping visions of a rationalized city of wide streets and elegant squares. These plans were largely not implemented, partly because land ownership was too complex and contested, partly because people simply needed to rebuild quickly and could not wait for grand schemes. But what did happen was significant. The new London was built in brick and stone rather than timber. The streets were widened. Building regulations were introduced specifying minimum standards for construction, the first meaningful building code in London's history. And Christopher Wren did get to build something in the cleared space. 51 new churches, including the masterpiece that replaced the old medieval cathedral. The new St. Paul's with its great dome, which became and remains one of the defining landmarks of the London skyline. The city that rose from the ashes was not the city that burned. It was broader, more open, more fire-resistant, more legible. The catastrophe created the possibility of improvement that normal circumstances would never have allowed. There is a lesson in there somewhere. Perhaps not one that recommends catastrophe as a development strategy, but a recognition that sometimes the things that burn down were overdue for replacement, and that the capacity of human communities to rebuild, given any reasonable opportunity, is one of the more reliable things about us. Let your eyes close now. The fire is out and the rebuilding is done, and the great dome is rising over the city, and the night is peaceful. Let us go back once more, further back to the ancient world, and to a story about ambition so enormous that it is still difficult to fully comprehend 2,300 years later. We are going to talk about Alexander of Macedon. Alexander the Great, a man who by the age of 30 had conquered more territory than any military commander before him, stretched his empire from Greece to the borders of India, founded a city in Egypt that would become one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world, and then died, possibly of typhoid, possibly of bad wine, definitely of something mundane and undramatic, which in its way seems like a fitting end to a life that was nothing but dramatic from start to finish. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Macedon, a Greek-speaking kingdom that the Greeks further south considered slightly backward, and that Alexander spent his life alternately trying to impress and proving wrong. His father Philip II had already transformed Macedon from a minor power into the dominant force in the Greek world through a combination of military innovation, ruthless diplomacy, and sheer energy. Philip invented the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of soldiers armed with 18-foot spears that was effectively unstoppable in open-field battles against conventional Greek infantry. He reorganized his army, hired the best engineers, and by the time Alexander was a teenager, Macedon was the superpower of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then Philip was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, probably, though not certainly, with Alexander's knowledge and possibly his involvement. The ancient sources are cautious on this point for understandable reasons. Alexander was 20 when he became king. The Greek states, which had been reluctantly subordinate to Philip, saw an opportunity in the succession. They rebelled. Alexander moved with a speed that would characterize his entire career, crushed the rebellions, and then made an example of Thebes by razing it to the ground as a message to anyone else contemplating resistance. He spared only the house of the poet Pindar, because Alexander was a man of extreme violence who also had genuine aesthetic sensibilities, which is a combination history has produced rather more often than we might hope. With Greece secured, Alexander turned east. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with an army of about 40,000 men and began the campaign that would not end for a decade. His stated goal was to avenge Greece against Persia for the invasions of 150 years earlier. His actual goal was almost certainly to conquer as much of the world as he could find. The two were not mutually exclusive. What followed was a series of battles that military historians still study for their tactical brilliance. The Battle of the Granicus River, the Battle of Issus, Gaugamela. Each time Alexander faced a Persian army substantially larger than his own, and each time he won, through a combination of aggressive cavalry tactics that he personally led, careful advance intelligence, and an almost preternatural ability to identify the decisive moment in a battle and exploit it. At Gaugamela in 331 BCE, he defeated the Persian great king Darius III with an army of perhaps 40,000 against a Persian force 10 times that size. by finding the gap in the enemy line and driving straight through it personally. Darius fled. His empire fell. And Alexander, rather than going home, kept going. He pursued Darius into Persia, found him murdered by his own nobles, and pressed further east into the territories that nobody from the Greek world had ever seen. Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush, the Punjab. He founded city after city, many of them named Alexandria. There were eventually more than 20 of them, each serving as an administrative center and a seat of Greek culture in the east. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest of them, eventually the site of the famous Library of Alexandria and one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world. But Alexander's men were getting tired. By 326 BCE, having crossed the Hindu Kush twice and fought campaigns across what is now Pakistan, the army mutinied. They had followed him across the known world. They had won battle after battle. They had walked and ridden and fought their way 3,000 miles from home. And they were done. Alexander tried to shame them into continuing. He is reported to have wept with frustration and then locked himself in his tent for 3 days, hoping they would change their minds. They did not. And so Alexander, for the only time in his life, turned back. He led his army through the Jedrosian desert on the way home, a route of legendary difficulty during which thousands died of thirst and heat and exhaustion. Whether this was a practical route or a deliberate punishment for the mutiny is debated by historians, who clearly have different opinions of Alexander's character. He reached Babylon in 323 BCE, planning further campaigns. West to Arabia, north to the Caspian, west again possibly to Carthage and Rome. And then he fell ill. He was 32 years old. After 10 days of fever, he died in Babylon, a long way from home, with half the world conquered and the other half still waiting. He left no clear heir, no organized succession, no plan for what happened after him. His generals divided the empire and spent the next several decades destroying each other, because that is what Alexander's generals did. And the empire that had taken 10 years to build collapsed within a generation. What he left behind, beyond the ruins and the successor kingdoms, was the spread of Greek language and culture across an enormous stretch of the ancient world. For the next several centuries, educated people from Egypt to India shared a common language and a common intellectual framework. Ideas traveled. Libraries were built. The philosophical and scientific traditions of Greece fused with the ancient knowledge of Egypt and Persia and India in ways that would shape Western thought for the next 2,000 years. When historians talk about the Hellenistic age that followed Alexander, they are describing a world that was broader, more connected, more culturally complex than anything that had existed before it. One young man's absurd ambition had, almost accidentally, created the conditions for one of history's great intellectual flourishings. So next time you feel that your goals might be slightly too large, remember that the man who tried to conquer the entire world was 22 years old when he started, and had an argument with his horse that he won. And finally, one more. We are going to end tonight with a journey, which seems appropriate, since that is what this whole evening has been. We are going to follow the Silk Road. Not in its entirety, which would take several months of actual travel and an implausible number of camels, but in spirit. The Silk Road was not actually a road. Or rather, it was many roads, shifting networks of routes across Central Asia that connected China to the Mediterranean world for roughly 1,000 years, from about the 2nd century BCE to the 15th century CE. The word silk gives you the impression that it was primarily a luxury trade, and silk was certainly part of it. Chinese silk was extraordinary, lighter and smoother and stronger than anything the West could produce, and people paid enormous prices for it. Roman senators imported it in such quantities that conservative moralists complained about money flowing east to buy fabric so thin, it was indistinguishable from wearing nothing. which was both an accurate description of what Roman silk garments looked like and a reliable way to ensure that the moralizing was entirely ignored. But the Silk Road carried much more than silk. Spices from India and Southeast Asia, so valuable that they would eventually motivate the great oceanic voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries. Paper invented in China and spreading slowly westward. Gunpowder, same trajectory. Porcelain, glass moving in the opposite direction. Cotton, dyes, horses critically, the Central Asian breeds that changed warfare wherever they reached. And ideas. Buddhism traveled the Silk Road from India into Central Asia and China. Islam spread along it in the other direction. Mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, medical techniques, artistic styles, all of them moving along those ancient routes carried in the minds of merchants and pilgrims and diplomats. Who actually traveled the Silk Road? Mostly not the people who produced the goods at one end or consumed them at the other. A bolt of Chinese silk might change hands dozens of times before it reached a Roman market, passing through the hands of Central Asian merchants, Parthian traders, Syrian middlemen, each taking a cut of the value. The idea of a single intrepid traveler walking from China to Rome is largely a fantasy, at least for most of the Silk Road's history. What existed was an overlapping chain of regional trading networks, each segment controlled by different peoples at different times. The Parthians dominated the central section for centuries and taxed the trade flowing through their territory with efficient enthusiasm. The Sogdians, a people of Central Asia whose merchant diaspora spread from China to the Byzantine Empire, were perhaps the most important long-distance traders of the Silk Road's peak period in the first millennium CE. Sogdian merchants had colonies strung across the trade routes, from Merv to Samarkand to Dunhuang to Chang'an, the Tang dynasty capital. Sogdian letters found in a watchtower in the Gobi Desert from the 4th century CE, written to merchants back home, describe the chaos caused by invasions, the disruption of trade, the difficulty of getting money back to your family when the roads are not safe. Business problems that would be recognizable to any merchant in any era. The human texture of commerce, unchanged across 16 centuries of time. The oasis cities along the routes became extraordinary places. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Kashgar, Dunhuang. These were cosmopolitan centers where you might hear a dozen languages spoken in a single market square, where Buddhist stupas stood beside Zoroastrian fire temples, alongside Nestorian Christian churches, alongside early mosques, where a traveler from any part of the known world would find someone who shared their language or could translate. The Silk Road was not just a trade route. It was a corridor of cultural encounter that produced some of the most interesting hybrid civilizations in history. Central Asian art from this period shows figures in Chinese dress, painted in the style of Iranian court painting with motifs borrowed from Greek Hellenistic art. The visual culture of the Silk Road looked like nothing anywhere else, because it had absorbed everything from everywhere. Marco Polo is the most famous Western traveler of the Silk Road, and his account of his journeys to the court of Kublai Khan in the 13th century remains one of the most astonishing travel documents ever written. Whether he actually went where he claimed, historians have debated vigorously for centuries. Some argue his account has too many gaps and errors for someone who actually made the journey. Others note that traveling 4,000 miles through war zones and over mountain passes might reasonably result in some imprecisions. Either way, his account, with its meticulous descriptions of the wealth and organization and sheer scale of the Mongol Empire and the Chinese cities he visited, was received in Europe as barely credible fantasy. Streets paved with marble, cities of 1 million people, sophisticated administrative systems, postal networks spanning continents. Europeans were not yet ready to believe that anywhere outside their known world could be so civilized, so organized, so large. The Silk Road had one more lesson to teach before it faded. In the mid-14th century, The same trade routes that had carried silk and spices and ideas across the continent also carried the Black Death out of Central Asia and into the Mediterranean world. The connectivity that made the Silk Road so extraordinarily productive also made it a highway for plague. The very openness that enabled commerce and cultural exchange enabled catastrophe with equal efficiency. It is a tension that has never gone away. The most connected the world is, the most quickly everything travels, good and bad alike. We are still living inside that particular lesson. And now, as the night grows deepest and the old roads stretch away into the dark, it is time to stop. We have traveled tonight from a medieval mud hut in the English winter to the courts of Tudor England, to a harbor full of ruined tea in colonial Boston, to the desert of Peru and the flood plains of Egypt and the burning streets of London and the battlefields of the ancient East and the endless shifting roads of the Silk Road. We have covered some ground, and none of it required you to leave your bed, which is, when you think about it, a pretty good deal. So close your eyes now. Let all of it settle. The history will keep. The roads will still be there tomorrow, all of them. Every one of those ancient connections still humming faintly in the world we have inherited. Sleep now. You have heard enough. The long night will take you the rest of the way. We have one more journey tonight. Back to the steps. To a story of ambition that rivals even Alexander's, executed at a scale that is almost impossible to hold in your head. We are going to talk about Temujin, who you probably know better as Genghis Khan. Born somewhere around 1162 in the borderlands of what is now Mongolia and Siberia, into a minor noble family of herders and horse people, Temujin had a childhood that was genuinely terrible even by the standards of the 12th century Mongolian steppe, which set a high bar. His father was poisoned when Temujin was 9 years old. His clan abandoned his family as a liability. He and his mother and siblings spent years in poverty and near starvation on the open grassland. At some point in his adolescence, he was captured and enslaved by a rival clan. He escaped. He was captured again. He built alliances. He was betrayed by childhood friends. He fought off enemies. And slowly, against remarkable odds, he gathered followers, demonstrated a gift for leadership and military tactics that was genuinely exceptional, and began the long process of unifying the perpetually warring Mongolian tribes under a single authority. By 1206, the process was complete. The Mongol clans, which had spent centuries destroying each other, had been organized into a single, coherent political and military structure. And Temujin was declared Genghis Khan, universal ruler. What followed was the largest land empire in human history. At its peak, the Mongol Empire covered roughly 24 million square kilometers, about 1/5 of the Earth's total land area. It stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. And it was built in roughly 50 years by a man who started with nothing. How? The military answer is that the Mongols developed a style of warfare that was almost impossible to counter with the armies of the time. They were horse archers, able to fire accurately from horseback at full gallop, and their composite bows had a range that exceeded most contemporary defenses. They moved faster than any army they faced, living off the land and their horses, requiring no supply lines of the kind that slowed conventional medieval armies. They used psychological warfare with deliberate skill, offering cities the choice between submission and annihilation, and following through on both options with absolute consistency. Cities that submitted were treated relatively well. Cities that resisted were destroyed, their populations killed or enslaved, as a demonstration to the next city of what resistance cost. The Mongols did not enjoy violence for its own sake exactly, but they understood that it was a highly efficient communicator of intention, and they used it accordingly. The administrative answer is perhaps more interesting. The Mongol Empire, at its functional best, was actually a remarkable piece of governance. Genghis Khan created a meritocratic military system in which promotion was based on ability rather than birth, which was genuinely unusual for the period. He created a legal code, the Yasa, that applied universally across the empire. He established religious tolerance, a policy that was both pragmatic and genuinely enlightened, since the empire encompassed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and shamanists, and trying to enforce religious uniformity would have created more problems than it solved. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, that followed the conquests created a period of relative stability across Eurasia that allowed trade and communication on a scale not seen before. The Silk Road reached one of its most active periods under Mongol administration. A single postal system, the Yam, connected the entire empire with relay stations staffed with horses, allowing messages and small goods to travel from China to Persia in weeks. Marco Polo's journey was possible in large part because the Mongol Empire had made Central Asia safer for travelers than it had been in centuries. The Black Death was also transmitted along these same routes, in the years after Genghis Khan's successors had extended the empire to its maximum extent. History is rarely simple. Genghis Khan himself died in 1227, the cause uncertain. His empire continued to expand under his sons and grandsons, reaching its greatest extent under his grandson Kublai Khan in the late 13th century. Then it fractured into successor states, as all empires eventually do, each going its own way. The Mongol Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, each eventually dissolving into the civilizations they had conquered, the conquerors absorbed by the conquered, which is perhaps the final answer to every empire's question about what it all meant. Genghis Khan himself asked his generals, at the end of a successful campaign, what the greatest happiness in life was. They answered variously: hunting, riding, victory in battle. He disagreed. The greatest happiness, he said, is to vanquish your enemies, to drive them before you, to see their cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love them shrouded in tears, and to gather to your bosom their wives and daughters. It is not a quote that invites admiration. And yet the man who said it also instituted religious tolerance and meritocratic promotion and a postal system. History is rarely simple and rarely comfortable, and never made up of people who fit cleanly into hero or villain. The steps are quiet now. The hoofbeats have faded. Let them fade. Breathe slowly. The grassland stretches to the horizon, and the sky is enormous, and there is nothing to do tonight but rest. One more. Just one more, and then we are done. Because I cannot take you through all of that history, all of those centuries of ambition and survival and burning cities, and rebuilt cities and empires rising and falling, without ending somewhere that is, in its own way, the opposite of all of that. We are going to end tonight in a library. The Library of Alexandria was, for roughly 600 years, the largest and most important repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Founded in the 3rd century BCE by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's former generals who had taken Egypt as his share of the divided empire, it was part of a larger institution called the Mausoleum, the museum, which was intended to be a universal center of learning. The ambition was extraordinary. The library aimed to collect a copy of every written work in existence. And it came remarkably close. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were required to submit any scrolls on board for copying, with the originals sometimes kept and copies returned to the owners, a policy that the owners often found annoying, and that was probably quite effective. Agents were sent to buy books throughout the Mediterranean world. The collections of rulers were borrowed, copied, and sometimes not returned. At its peak, estimates suggest the library held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, covering every subject from mathematics to medicine to poetry to philosophy to astronomy. It was the largest collection of human knowledge in the ancient world. The scholars who worked at the library were extraordinary. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth to within a few percent accuracy, using shadows and geometry, 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry there, the foundational text of mathematics that was still being used as a textbook in the 19th century. Archimedes may have studied there. Hero of Alexandria invented what was effectively a steam engine 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution, though it was used primarily as a novelty rather than a source of power. The library created a culture of systematic inquiry, of accumulating and comparing and testing knowledge that was genuinely unprecedented in the ancient world. The story of its destruction is one that haunts the imagination. It was not, as the popular account has it, burned in a single catastrophic fire by Julius Caesar or by Muslim invaders or by Christians. The truth is more mundane and in some ways more depressing. It declined slowly. Funding was cut. Political upheavals disrupted its operations. Scholars dispersed. Scrolls were not replaced when they wore out. Julius Caesar's fleet did accidentally set fire to some books on the docks of Alexandria in 48 BCE, possibly some from the library, but this was not the end. The institution persisted for centuries after. It faded gradually, the way important things often fade, not in one dramatic catastrophe, but in the slow accumulation of small indifferences, of priorities shifting, of people deciding that maintaining the largest library in the world was someone else's problem. What was lost when it finally ceased to function, we cannot know. We know that ancient sources mention works by hundreds of authors that no longer exist. Plays, scientific treatises, historical accounts, philosophical works. All gone. Not burned in a single night, but lost in the long entropy of time. What survived mostly by accident, by being copied often enough in enough places that some copies outlasted the original institutions. The Iliad and the Odyssey, the plays of Sophocles, the mathematics of Euclid. We have those because people kept copying them. What we lost was everything that was not copied often enough, everything that existed in too few copies in too few places, everything that depended on the continued functioning of the one great institution that housed it. The Library of Alexandria teaches us something, in its long, slow fading, about the fragility of knowledge. About how easily the accumulated understanding of generations can be lost, not to catastrophe, but simply to neglect. And perhaps, by contrast, about how valuable the things we still have are. All of history that you have traveled through tonight, the medieval winters and the Tudor courts and the burning cities and the ancient empires and the desert trade routes, all of it survived because someone thought it was worth writing down, and someone else thought it was worth copying, and someone else thought it was worth preserving, across hundreds and thousands of years, down to you, tonight, in your warm bed at the far end of all of it. You are the latest custodian of all of that. Which is something. Close your eyes. The library is quiet and the lamps are burning low, and the scholars have gone home for the night. The scrolls are on their shelves. The knowledge is safe for now, as much of it as we still have. And it will keep until morning. Sleep. You have done enough traveling for one night. The long night will keep you. Rest now. Sleep. And one last thing before the night is done. We have ranged widely tonight. We began with mud and cold and medieval survival, and we have wandered through centuries and continents, through courts and wars and libraries and deserts and burning cities. But I want to end where we started. In the dark, in the quiet, in the small, stubborn space that human beings have always carved out against the night. There is something that connects all of the stories we have told tonight. From the medieval peasant banking the fire to Alexander crossing the Hindu Kush to the scholars of Alexandria copying their scrolls to the Mongol writers on the steppe. All of them were doing the same thing in their different ways, in their different centuries. They were trying to push back the dark. With fire, with knowledge, with speed, with monuments, with words. The human project has always been, at its most fundamental, a negotiation with the night. With darkness, with cold, with uncertainty, with the knowledge that everything ends. Every fire that was ever banked against a winter night was a small act of defiance. Every library that was ever built was a way of saying that what we know matters, that it should be preserved, that the people who come after us deserve to inherit it. Every city that was ever rebuilt after burning was a refusal to accept that destruction is the final word. And yet, here you are. The fire is low. The history is quiet. The stories are done for tonight. And the thing about the dark is that sometimes the most useful thing you can do with it is simply sleep. Not fight it. Not conquer it. Not build anything in it. Just rest and trust that the morning will come, as it always has. The medieval peasant knew this. After the long work of banking the fire and patching the walls and counting the stores and settling the animals, there came a point at which there was nothing more to do. And they lay down, all of them together in the warmth they had carefully preserved, and they let the dark do what it does. They trusted the morning to come. And it did. It always did. 4.5 billion years of mornings, and not one has yet failed to arrive. That is a record of reliability that deserves some respect. So, the fire is banked. The scrolls are on their shelves. The longship is drawn up on the beach. The steppe is quiet. The pyramids are standing as they have stood for 4,500 years. The roads are empty. The camels have found their rest. And somewhere in the dark of a Boston harbor, the tea is still slowly settling to the bottom of the mud. And you are here, warm and safe at the end of all of it, at the end of a very long night of history, with all of that accumulated human stubbornness in your blood, with all of those banked fires and rebuilt libraries and refused surrenders somewhere in your inheritance. Sleep now. The morning knows where to find you. The long night is doing its work. Let it. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let everything go quiet. The fire is low. The history will keep. You have done enough. Sleep. Sleep well.